Hey everyone, this is segment 4 of the VBU series, A Defense of the Christian Faith. And I'm really glad you have continued with us this far. We've been getting into some heady subjects, and today is going to be no different, so put on your thinking caps. Remember, this is Valley Baptist University, not Valley Baptist Sunday School, although Sunday School can and sometimes does teach many of these kinds of topics. Now, we continue today on the subject, the existence of God, with part 2 of the theme, Why Does the Universe Appear Designed? Now, a little bit of a recap. You could put it this way. The atheist or physicalist infers, based on the perceived strength of evidences, that there is no God, or that we just cannot really make a conclusion about this, and that the physical is really all there is, or is probably all there is. As one atheist put it, that the cosmos that's physical is all that was, all that is, and all that ever will be. The Christian thinker looks at the evidence and says, no, we can make very strong inferences from reality. This is the same methodology, making inferences from reality to a very different explanation and considering this to be the best explanation. This is sometimes called abductive reasoning, meaning inference to the best explanation. This is used all the time, not only in virtually every discipline, but even in everyday life. Now, another thing, keep in mind, this series is from a perspective of classical apologetics, which means that it systematically builds on itself. As I've noted in previous segments, there's no one of these arguments that's intended to stand on its own. And also, where we are currently is just barely scratching the surface of a grounding for an inference to a biblical Christian God. Instead, what we've looked at with like the cosmological argument, where we had the question, why is there something instead of nothing? What we have inferred is merely a transcendent metaphysical cause, something that is which necessary and is non-contingent or not dependent. Now we're on design arguments, sometimes called teleological argumentation. And simply put, the argument is where there is design, the best explanation is there is a designer. This is the grounding for inferring that this metaphysical cause is intelligent. So, we looked last time at the evidence for design in the outer cosmos, including subjects like the fine-tuning of the universe, the earth being in a privileged position for life, and even for making discovery. Today, we take the subject from outer space to inner space. And we're going to look at several subjects that are just going to stand as foundational blocks that build on each other. When we get to the final inference, you'll see where we are going. So try to be patient and again, put on your thinking caps. So number 1, we're going to look at the not so simple cell. Now, an individual in history most people have heard of, his name is Charles Darwin. We're going to look more at Charles Darwin in the future, but today in just an introductory way, the assumption in Darwin's day was the utter simplicity of molecular biology. The assumption was that the cell was just a simple blob of jelly, what they called protoplasm. And in his seminal book, Origin of Species, Darwin's theory of biological evolution actually did not explain or even attempt to explain the origins of not only everything, but even how the first life, presumably this simple one-celled organism, might have arisen. Instead, Darwin's theory sought to explain the origin of new forms from simpler pre-existing forms. In Darwin's day, the microscopes were comparatively crude and rudimentary, and along with this, much evidence shows Darwin and his followers needed to embrace this simplicity to fit their construct, or you could say their biased narrative. Dr. Stephen Meyer, with a pedigree of PhD in Cambridge, says that in the 1860s and 70s, many biologists thought they could devise a materialistic evolutionary explanation for the origin of the first life. Well, why did they think that? They thought it was easy. They assumed that life was composed of a rather simple substance called protoplasm, and that this could be easily constructed by just combining or recombining simple chemicals like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. Others, however, pointed out now, just like Michael Denton, PhD in chemistry from King's College London, in his book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, Denton says this. He says the gulf between the non-living and the living world represents the most dramatic and fundamental of all discontinuities in nature. He says between a living cell and the most highly ordered non-biological systems like a crystal or a snowflake, he says there is a chasm that is as vast and absolute as it is possible to conceive. So the question is, what do we do with this chasm? We've looked before at the question, why is there something instead of nothing? Now we're looking at the question, why is there life instead of non-life? Oxford professor John Lennox, in his book Cosmic Chemistry, he says, as it turns out, we have even in the so-called simplest living cell, which is this basic constituent of any organism, he says we have in that a mind-boggling structure. In fact, Lennox writes, he says, we humans are made up of somewhere between 50 and 70 trillion cells. He says even a single cell is incredibly complex. There's even a respected French biochemist, Jacques Monod, who said that the simplest cells available to us for study have nothing, Monod says, have nothing primitive about that. In fact, biochemist Bruce Alberts, who's the president of the National Academy of Sciences, says this. He says the entire simplest cell can be viewed as a factory. I hear these words, a factory that contains an elaborate network of interlocking assembly lines, each of which is composed of a large set of protein machines. And he says, why do we call the large protein assemblies that underlie cell function protein machines? He says, we call these machines because, like machines invented by humans, hear what he's saying, like machines invented by humans to deal efficiently with the macroscopic world, he says these protein assemblies contain highly coordinated moving parts. Now, after thinking about that, we move from the not-so-simple cell to number 2, irreducibly complex organs. So is there complexity? The scientific consensus is yes, absolutely there's complexity. But some will say, well, complexity doesn't mean intelligent design. Well, now we're on number 2. What about irreducibly complex organs? Now, irreducible complexity is sort of a mouthful. How can it be defined? Here is a description. Irreducible complexity is a description of the kind of system that cannot be produced directly by slight successive modifications from a precursor system, because that precursor system that's missing a part is by definition non-functional. Think of it this way. Proponents of this use an illustration like a mousetrap. If a mousetrap was to attempt to gradually morph more and more into some other kind of functional system, when the slightest part gets removed, it ceases being a mousetrap. So it's impossible for it to morph from all of our physicalist understandings into something else. Michael Behe, a key player in this, he is a biochemist at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He was at one time a theistic evolutionist. In other words, he did not have a dog in this fight. As a Catholic theistic evolutionist, he came to the conclusion purely based on inferring from scientific evidence that there is this problem called irreducible complexity that Darwin's theory cannot deal with. In fact, he juxtaposes Darwin's famous quote from Origin of Species to his own statement from his book in 1996, Darwin's Black Box. I'm going to put these quotes next to each other right now. First, the quote from Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin said in the 1800s, if it could be demonstrated, hear what he's saying, he's making his Darwinian evolutionary view falsifiable. Is it falsifiable? Think with me. Darwin says if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, Darwin says my theory would absolutely break down. So here's Michael Behe, biochemist, 1996, from his book, Darwin's Black Box. Behe says no one at Harvard University, no one at the National Institutes of Health, no member of the National Academy of Sciences, no Nobel Prize winner, no one at all can give a detailed account of how the cilium or vision or blood clotting or any biochemical process might have developed in an unguided Darwinian fashion. Behe says, but we're here. All these things got here somehow, if not in our Darwinian fashion, then how? This is an example of why John Lennox at Oxford would say that the molecular biology of the cell shows the same order of fine-tuning that we saw earlier in connection with physics and cosmology. So we've looked at number one, at the not so simple cell. Cells are complex. Not only complex, but number two, irreducibly complex. And not only irreducibly complex, but to add on to that, number three, we're going to look at specified complexity or specified information in molecular biology. T.H. Huxley, following Darwin, tried to concoct a simple method called chemical evolutionary theory. He was trying to explain the origin of the first cell. And then decades later, there was another version of this that was set forth by a Russian biochemist. However, what these and others through the 1930s were not able to comprehend was the complexity of information-bearing properties. These information-bearing properties that existed in DNA, RNA, and proteins that make life possible. In fact, Dr. Meyer writes, these early biochemists knew nothing of the importance of information to living systems. Instead, they assumed, I want you to hear these words, they assumed that the universe consisted of two fundamental entities, matter and energy. That was the assumption. But then during the 1950s and 60s, molecular biologists discovered a third fundamental entity, that of the foundation of life, being information. Meyer says that the difficulty of understanding this was not just the origin of information, but the kind of information that DNA and RNA and proteins contain. For example, DNA does not just contain information in just the mathematical sense, but in what is called functional specificity. Stephen Meyer explains it like being able to notice the qualitative difference between two strings of characters that I'm going to put up here. You look at the top string and you see letters and characters that we all recognize, but there's no message to it. In the next one, we have a very clear message. Time and tide wait for no man. The top is recognizable letters and characters, but the bottom string performs a communication function. The top string doesn't. This is called specified information or specified complexity. Putting it another way, specified complexity is not merely redundant order. Somebody says, well, of course there's order in nature that can be produced by nature. Well, perhaps redundant order like A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. But nature doesn't produce for us the equivalent of there's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The point again is that made here, the second string of characters is not the kind of periodic order that natural laws describe or generate. One gives us order, but not information. So in other words, what needs explanation is not the origin of order, but the origin of information. Again, this can be called specified or functional information, meaning that it performs a function. Proponents of this view see this as like the ordinary dictionary sense of what is meant by information, defining information as alternative sequences or arrangements of character that produce a specified effect. There's so many that recognize this, even though they don't go so as far as to becoming theists or even Christian theists. Leroy Hood, a biotechnology specialist, he describes information in DNA as digital code. Bill Gates, the famous software king, he compares DNA to a computer program. Now, some would push back and say, oh, but there's junk DNA. I want to challenge you to do your research on this. You're going to see that this has fallen under great scrutiny and cutting-edge research. In fact, Jonathan Wells wrote an entire book called The Myth of Junk DNA. We're not going to chase that rabbit right now, but all of these together still have given this grounding of people like Michael Behe to conclude if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. In fact, Wilberforce, from a William Dembski edited book called Evidence for God, he says, look, in any other field, things that look like they've been carefully engineered are presumed to be engineered. So we're talking about an inference to a nano-engineer or an intelligent designer. And this is where detractors will often push back. Detractors will say, no, we can't infer an intelligent nano-engineer outside of nature because that doesn't comport with uniform experience. Well, does it or doesn't it? And what else doesn't conform with uniform experience? In fact, we're going to look in the future at the uniform experience of individuals who have had a uniform experience of God according to the interviewed data. But Charles Lyell was a geologist who influenced Charles Darwin on his methodology on this subject of uniform experience. He used inference to the best explanation principles, and Lyell said we should cite causes known from our uniform experiences. So the question is, how do we address this DNA enigma based on uniform experience? Dr. Meyer very bluntly says, if neither chance, nor physical chemical necessity, nor the two acting in a combination produces specified information, then what does? Meyer puts it this way. He asks the question, do we know of any cause now in operation that has the power to create large amounts of specified information? Well, Henry Quayler, in his book, The Emergence of Biological Organization, this Austrian physician and radiologist who pioneered information theory applied to biology, Quayler says the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious and rational activity. In other words, specified information in the cell points to intelligent design as the best explanation. Why? Because as Meyer and his colleagues Ann Geiger and Paul Nelson put it, our uniform and repeated experience affirms the only source for information-rich programs is intelligent agency. In other words, design infers a designer. Or in this case, you could say a program infers a programmer. Now, the skeptics understand this. If they didn't, there wouldn't be all of the pushback. Richard Dawkins has pushed back on it this way. Well, the capacity to word processing is an emergent property of computers. John Lennox responds, He says, yeah, but look, this is utterly dependent on the input of specified information contained in an intelligently designed software package like Microsoft Word. In fact, referencing Richard Dawkins' Blind Watchmaker book terminology, Lennox says, there's one thing certain, no blind watchmaker process gives the rise to a word processing capacity of a digital computer. And so he says that's not all. Proteins exhibit such a high degree of molecular sensitivity. He says it's in the sense that even the substitution of a single amino acid in viable protein can mean a catastrophic failure. In other words, as we've defined it, it's irreducibly complex. Lennox goes on again. He says argument now, of course, can be made. The molecular biology of the cell shows the same order of fine-tuning that we saw earlier in connection with physics and cosmology. Now, the very common pushback at this point is, no, that's God of the gaps. Or at least you're inserting intelligent designer of the gaps. Let's retrace what that argument is. The God of the gaps argument is that we see God or intelligent design as an explanation out of laziness to put an end to discovery, whereas the one saying don't insert God of the gap says no, the trend is going more and more towards purely naturalistic explanations. You're just grasping at straws to invoke a transcendent designer, and that's just laziness. You're bringing about an end of science. William Dembski, again from his edited book Evidence for God, a quote from it goes like this: no, absolutely not. The trend has been toward the unveiling of more and more complicated systems, not mechanisms that show how they are produced. The trend is going towards the intelligent designer as the answer to the data, not the other way around. Modern molecular biology has been an absolute affront to Darwinian evolution. And someone says, so if that's the case, then are skeptics merely just ignoring these principles? Well, yeah. Many of them will dismiss these before even giving them a consideration. However, there are others that use this basic premise to support their ideas. One was Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan wrote a book called Contact. It became a movie starring Jodie Foster. In the movie Contact, and this character that Jodie Foster played, they sent messages into space to try to find intelligent conscious messages coming back. And they concluded, oh, we have intelligent conscious messages. How did they come to this conclusion? It was based on specified information principles. From those principles, they came to the conclusion there is conscious, intelligent life out there. You ask the question, why didn't the character just conclude there's nature out there? Because Carl Sagan understood these principles and the ramifications of this. Dean Kenyon, a PhD at Stanford, professor emeritus of biology at San Francisco State University, Kenyon was an authority on chemical evolutionary theory and the scientific study of the origin of life. He had a PhD in biophysics from Stanford. He researched with NASA. He's professor emeritus of biology at San Francisco State University. Kenyon for years was certain he could overcome this DNA enigma, and so he postulated a naturalist explanation of self-organization. But after he kept re-examining it, and at a pivotal point, being confronted by the student in his class, by the mid-'80s, he ended up concluding that digital information in DNA provided evidence for intelligent purpose or design in the cosmos. At an international conference of theists and atheists in 1985 in Dallas, he made a presentation. He called it Going Beyond a Naturalistic Approach to the Origin of Life. As a result, Kenyon stated the theological question should now be reopened by the philosophers. In fact, if you want to go further than this, Thomas Nagel, who has this massive pedigree, including Cornell, Oxford, Harvard, he's professor of philosophy emeritus at New York University. This is one of the world's elite thinkers. And this scholar dropped a book in 2012 called Mind and Cosmos. And his subtitle of the book is Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. At this juncture, Nagel is not even a professing Christian. He is speaking to his own camp, and he is telling his own colleagues, your naturalistic explanations, specifically unguided Darwinian models, do not work. Quoting directly from his book, he says the more details, again, notice the trajectory. He says the more details we learn about the chemical basis of life and the intricacy of the genetic code, he says the more unbelievable the standard historical account becomes. He even uses these words. He says this current orthodoxy, he says this orthodoxy of our scientism culture is the product of governing assumptions that are unsupported. And he says this, it flies in the face of common sense. Well, then we ask the question, so why is it that these brilliant scientists don't know this? I challenge you to understand that they do. I had an opportunity to see a film starring Ben Stein the weekend that it opened. It's a film called Expelled. You might know Ben Stein from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the actor. Bueller, anyone? He's actually a very intelligent speechwriter, not a Christian, but a Jewish theist. And in the film Expelled, he interviews Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins reveals that he acknowledges molecular biology might reveal the signature of some sort of designer. If you read some of Dawkins' books, he'll tell you, no, the design hypothesis doesn't work. But then when he gets asked, even on camera, in a private conversation, he says, yes, there's a signature of some sort of designer. But guess what he speculates? Dawkins speculates that life on Earth might have originated as the result of higher alien intelligence. Now put on your human intelligence for a moment, if you will. What we have here is another backhanded compliment to the intelligent design thesis. We have this origin of life that seems, according to Richard Dawkins, seems to be intelligently designed. How is it dealt with? Oh, we can deal with this. We're going to assert intelligent guidance of aliens. Now, there's so many things we can say about this. One thing is, how is this not a lazy appeal to aliens of the gaps? However, there are also numerous Christian thinkers who've contemplated the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligent life, and they have not seen this as a contradiction to a biblical worldview. That includes C.S. Lewis as early as the 1930s. But even more so, unless the aliens transcend our material cosmos, meaning that they're metaphysical, meaning that they are beyond physical, unless they transcend that, they have just pushed the problem back. They've pushed the same problem into outer space that we have in our own planet. The problem is that these material, this cosmos physical aliens themselves would have to have life with the signature of being intelligently designed. Think of it this way. Cosmologically speaking, we ask the question, and you could apply it to the aliens. Why are there aliens instead of no aliens? Theologically speaking, with design, we ask the question, why do these aliens have specified and irreducible complexity? Or, if the aliens do transcend the cosmos and have characteristics such as eternality, now hear me out, listener, that's what the theist is essentially saying is God. That's what we call God. Dawkins does just about everything but admit this in his 2006 book, The God Delusion. Listen to this quote. I'm quoting directly from it. In my copy, it's found on page 98. He says, whether we ever get to know about them or not, there are very probably alien civilizations that are superhuman to the point of being godlike. I want you to hear this very remarkable statement. Very probably, even if we never get to know them or not. Now, Dawkins tries to qualify the difference between gods and being godlike, but mostly what we're looking at here is the methodology and the inference that's being made. Notice he is using inference to a perceived best explanation that says whether we get to know them or not. In other words, whether we ever see them, whether we can examine them by direct empirical investigation, Dawkins is inferring to an explanation based on evidence the assertion of godlike aliens as very probable. And so we, as well as anyone like Lennox and countless people who have responded to Dawkins, why not, through inference to the best explanation of even just the same evidence, let alone what we're going to look at in the future of this series, why not with just inference to the same explanation of the same evidence from what we've looked at, why not assert a godlike God? Someone says, I don't think there's a God, but based on this evidence, I do think there's an eternal, transcendent, intelligent, conscious alien. If this is helpful for your terminology, we can change the semantics for the sake of where we are at this juncture. That's what's meant by God. God is the eternal, transcendent, intelligent, conscious, if you prefer, alien. Now, thinking in terms of human life, which of these questions best comports with reality from what we've just looked at? Which of these statements would someone say is aging well? I'm going to put these juxtaposed to each other. The first one is, I am the result of merely unguided physical mutations. That's the Darwinian statement. Here's another statement. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. That's the biblical statement from David in Psalm 139. Now, even if you double down on that first statement, I am merely the product of unguided, impersonal mutations, even if you prefer landing on that first one, I am, here's a question. What does someone even mean by I? Who is this I making the statement? When I or you, when I refer to I, do I mean an actual self? Or is this just the sum total of components of a material body and brain making this statement? Is this I merely just a moist computer that's communicating this declaration? That is what we're going to look at next time as we explore the subject of mind and consciousness. Hope to see you next time, and be blessed today.